Topic Notes 3.3 Biodiversity. When people think of diversity in the environment, most often they'll think about a rainforest. This is a picture of a tropical rainforest in Costa Rica that I got a chance to do some field work in a few years back. Rainforests are incredibly diverse because they're very complex, they have very stable systems, they usually exist in warm, wet climates. Well, the same sort of factors will often play a part in the diversity of the ocean. In fact, you might already know this, but the most diverse habitat in the marine environment is a coral reef. So we're going to dive into the topic of diversity and look at it through the lens of the marine environment. So, main ideas here. Biodiversity is the measure of the variety of living organisms and is related to ecosystem stability. So we'll be focusing on those concepts. So here's our learning goals. All right, let's get started with the basic concepts here. Biodiversity. It is really a very broad concept, and you can look at it in various different ways. The basics is, of course, that's the variety and variability of life, which is very true. And you can look at biodiversity at a planet-wide scale, or you can look at it in a specific habitat or ecosystem, various types of scales. We can look at diversity in several different ways. We can look at it as in genetic diversity of a population and the various different traits that are exemplified in their phenotype. We can look at habitat diversity and ecosystem diversity, which often is related to the type of diversity you see in the last component, which would be species diversity. How many different types of species do you have in that particular community? Now we're going to focus on species diversity, specifically because we're going to be measuring this throughout the year. And you can look at species diversity and break it down into two different components, richness and evenness. To give you an example how this works, I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of some of the types of field studies that we do here in the Academy. We will often go out into the Lake Worth Lagoon and measure and sample diversity using seine nets. Now, seine nets are these long nets with floats on the top and weights on the bottom, and we basically drag them through the shallow water and then pull them up and count what's there. Now, we've got lots of different species that get collected into these nets, and we count each individual species, but we also count how many of each species there might be. A lot of the fish that you'll see flopping around there in the net are what we call moheras or pinfish or a number of different things. So we have data collectors out there, and as students count and collect the specific fish, they call out what they have. Hey, I got 4 mohera. Oh, I've got 3 juvenile grunts. Oh, I've got a checker pufferfish, whatever that number is. And then we count all that up. Now, when we identify the number of different species that we found in that net, that's species richness. So let's say we found 5 different species. We found a mohair, we found pinfish, we found barracuda, we found checkered pufferfish, we found a needlefish. 5 different species. But when we look at the evenness, the relative proportion of each of those species, we might find that we actually found about 300 mohera, but we only found 1 barracuda. That kind of ratio. That's evenness. And we can actually apply those numbers into an equation to give us a better index of the diversity in a particular area. So here's an example of a species diversity index that we will be employing here in the program. It's called the Simpson's Index. And the Simpson's Index is actually really simple. I know the equation sort of looks a little scary, but basically if you break down the variables, D is the diversity index that we're looking at, particularly the Simpsons. capital N is the total number of organisms of all the species found. Every individual that we found, doesn't matter what species it is, everything we found. And then N, the lowercase n, is the number of individuals of a particular species. So again, let's say we had 300 mohair and 1 barracuda and 3 checkered puffers, or whatever the case may be. That's kind of what that is. And we plug all that information into the index and we get a number. Now these index numbers then can be compared from site to site in a particular lagoon area, or based on different days, different tides, different conditions, and we can then get a better understanding of what's going on diversity-wise in a particular ecosystem. You'll get the chance to practice this for real a little later on in the year. So back to the concept of diversity in general, there are various different factors that influence biodiversity, and they range from kind of physical environmental factors, such as the stability of the environment. Is there a supply of nutrients for your producers? Is the temperature warm and steady? Is there a lot of light availability? Dissolved oxygen? What are the currents and waves like? That kind of thing. So there's that physical stuff. And then you've got niche structure. How many different types of niches is there available in the area, depending on the structure of the habitat and the circumstances thereof. Keystone species do play into this as well. So we look at these different factors when we're evaluating the diversity, even when we're using diversity indices like we just went over. So after studying all of these components, we've kind of got a good handle on what makes a more diverse habitat over a lower diverse habitat. In general, when we have extremes of one sort or another, we tend to have more of an unstable system, and thus the diversity tends to be low because the living things that are there have to struggle with those extremes. So what do we mean by extremes? So habitats experience various different disturbances, and it's the extent of those disturbances that tend to deal with the extremes that keep diversity lower. For example, if you have a lot of sandy, muddy shores with tides coming in and out, you don't have a lot of stability there. That's, one example. Another we throw out a lot is the hydrothermal vent communities. Now, these are very strange communities to most people unless you've kind of been learning marine science for a while. But just think of it this way. There are volcanoes underwater, if you will, right? Well, let's say some of those volcanic activity, it doesn't actually form a straight up volcano. There's just heat under the sediment, under the seafloor. And that heat superheats the water in the bedrock and in the sediments, and that water dissolves minerals in that sediment, and then it comes spewing out because it's much less dense, of course, than the surrounding very, very cold seawater. And as it spews out, it hits that cold seawater, the minerals condense and precipitate and start forming chimneys. Kind of like if you've ever been to a cave and you've seen stalactites and stalagmites. Well, that's kind of what's happening. So the picture on the bottom is of a hydrothermal vent. We have hydrothermal vents along our mid-Atlantic ridge in the Atlantic Ocean. We have it along the East Pacific Rise in the Pacific and other places around the world. Now, these habitats are the definition of extreme. They are at extreme depth, so you have very high pressure. They have extreme temperatures. The average ocean temperature down there is like 2 or 3 degrees Celsius. But at the vents themselves, you have superheated water that is extremely hot. So there's a huge dichotomy there. Then, of course, you have the fact that there is no sunlight. This is far deeper than sunlight can penetrate. So again, you're looking at a very, very harsh environment for living things to colonize. Yet they do, and they do because of chemosynthesis, which we're going to get into a little bit more in the next lecture. But basically, it's bacteria that provide food. So what we found by studying these habitats is that they are in existence only because of the geothermal energy that's put into them. Basically, if you don't have that heat that creates the chimneys, you don't have the chemicals dissolved in the water, and you don't have the bacteria that forms the base of the food chain. So as soon as that geologic thermal energy kind of dissipates because maybe the plate moves on or something changes in the way the heated material is moving under the crust, then that particular hydrothermal vent shuts down and a new one will pop up somewhere else. And then the organisms have to recolonize that area and everything in the previous dormant area dies off. So it's a very extreme environment. Now, of course, on the other side of things, if you have environments that are very stable for long periods of time, you tend to have that higher diversity. Habitats that have this don't have a lot of disturbances, or the disturbances are relatively infrequent and minimal. And the examples here would be a coral reef. They tend to exist in very stable environments. That's why you tend to have them around the tropics. If you look at the distribution of coral reefs around the globe, they tend to be around the equator. They are warm, they're stable salinities. There's not a whole lot of change going on. So it allows a lot of species to become very specialized. So when I just said specialized, we're going to get into niches again, kind of reframing that a little bit and adding to the story. Basically, ecological niches, or remember, a niche is a particular organism's role in the community. They may be very broad, meaning they can eat lots of things, be in lots of places, they don't care, or they can be very narrow, where they really only have a couple of different food sources and they need a particular type of habitat to find them or survive. So of course, we have the spectrum in between. Generally speaking, when you have a high level of biodiversity, generally due to some sort of stable environmental patterns, you have species that have time to evolve together. And because the diversity gets high, competition for limited resources will get high. And thus, evolution will start to push various different species to specialize, to try and avoid competition in any way they can. Now, this happens literally over millions of years. This is not something that happens overnight. So it really does take a really long time. So you need long-term stability to get to that high diversity level. So an example of this would be a specialized niche, or species with specialized niches. And that means they have usually a narrow food range in terms of their requirements. They have generally very specific habitat requirements. An example of this would be butterfly fish in general. They tend to have very what we call protractile, or very small pointy mouths. And they use those mouths to get into little spaces to get little tiny invertebrates or worms, and even little polyps from different types of corals, zoanthids, gorgonians, things like that. So they're very specific on what they're eating, and they require that coral reef to feed. Now here's a little video of these four-eyed butterfly fish in a reef structure out in the Keys, and you can see them using their little mouths to pick on little things on the coral. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have generalized niches. Now, these mean that these species can generally exploit quite a wide range of food sources. They can go all over the place. And an example of this are tuna. Now, tuna are very large fish for the most part. They tend to be migratory. They feed on all sorts of different things throughout the ocean, and so they tend to be considered generalized in their niche structure. Which means if a particular fish population or food population that they're going after drops, then they'll go to the next, and they're fine with that. They'll migrate to different areas to find new food sources. So if something happens to the ocean environment that changes things, tuna are more likely to be able to rebound from that than, say, a butterfly fish. So once again, just kind of wrapping this concept up, habitats that have these higher diversity and have more specialized niches over time, they tend to be the types of habitats that have critical problems when a change does come. For example, when we look at climate changes that are going on globally, coral reefs are kind of at the forefront of those sorts of problems. the species that live there don't have a lot of flexibility to really deal with those issues. The species that live there have very narrow specialized niches. Now, of course, that's really great at reducing competition, but not very good at dealing with monkey wrenches being thrown into the system. Now, biodiversity can fluctuate throughout time, and we've seen that through the fossil record if you look at geological time frames. So there are natural factors that will decrease diversity and again increase diversity. So there are some fluctuations there. However, humans are very good at throwing monkey wrenches into the biodiversity framework of the current state of affairs here on planet Earth. So there are definitely lots of threats to biodiversity coming from humans. One of them, of course, is habitat destruction. If you've ever been along the coastline in South Florida, you know that there's not a lot of natural coastline left. There's a lot of condos and developments. That has an impact on the coastal system. You're destroying habitat that actually relates to estuaries and beaches and dune systems that support a certain amount of life, which is problematic. We also tend to do things like introducing exotic species. The lionfish you see there in that picture their population is just exploding across Florida and the Caribbean. They were introduced through the aquarium trade in various different ways, which we'll get into another time. But they're really having a huge impact because they consume lots of different fish native to our area, and they don't really have any natural predators. So that's a big problem. Of course, pollution in general can be a big problem. Runoff from our coastal developed areas can add excess nutrients into the water, as well as other types of chemicals, whether it be, gas, oil runoff, things like that. If you've been around South Florida enough, you probably have heard of the toxic algae issue that's been going up and down our coast. That's part of that story. Then, of course, there's the overharvesting of fish globally. And this has been a big issue because we have collapsed several fish stocks out there where they're completely gone. We've almost overextended quite a few others. And so there's a lot of stress on the marine environment. And when you're taking that much out, you're impacting natural rhythms within the system, predator-prey relationships, all of those sorts of population dynamics. When we look at it from a human perspective, 15% of the protein that we consume globally is actually seafood. And that number moves up to about 50% in some Asian countries. So seafood is an extremely important resource for us. And if you look at this chart, you're going to see how overexploited our fish stocks are globally. On the left side, it shows basically around the 1950s, and on the right side, it shows around 2003. And there's underexploited, fully exploited, overexploited, and crashed. You can look where we have back in the 1950s, almost 85% were sustainably fished or underexploited. At this point, and we're even farther than 2003 today, 32% of the stocks have literally collapsed. So it's a huge difference. And this does mean something for human, food resources as well as biodiversity. Okay, the last little bit we're going to talk about today is succession, and this actually has an impact on diversity over time. Succession is that gradual process of community development that generally involves stages of various different species replacing others as you move forward. For example, in a brand new beach and dune habitat, you might start to have some sea oats and other plants that will start to hold sand to kind of build a dune. Then those are your pioneer species. Those pioneer species allow other species to grow behind them, or as the dune starts to develop and block the harsh conditions from the ocean, other species will come in and grow. That's the successional process, and eventually you end up with a climax community or a final stage of diversity. Now, climax communities are not static. You could have a major hurricane come through and rip through the dune system and knock it back successional stages. So these things are fluctuating in time. Another example of succession happens at the hydrothermal vents that we were talking about before. One of the primary colonizers of hydrothermal vents are tube worms. Now, the first type of tube worm we'll talk about is Tavnia. And Tavnia is on the left, and you can see they're much smaller tubes, little red headdresses coming off of the worms. On the right side, you'll see Riftia. Riftia are much larger worms. In fact, on the very top picture, you'll see a scientist holding a Riftia tube worm outside of its tube. They can get up to almost 2 meters long. When a hydrothermal vent community starts up, the Tabnia will actually colonize first, but eventually the Riftia will start to develop. And this is simply because the faster growing Riftia will overtake the slower growing Tabnia over time. The picture in the middle actually shows both the two different types of tube worms together. You can see the Riftia already starting to colonize and eventually outgrow the Tabnia. Another example is a whale fall. Now, whale falls basically happen when whales die. Usually they die out in the open ocean and their bodies drop to the bottom eventually. And they create an entire ecosystem for sometimes years on end as they are decomposed and eaten very slowly in the deep sea. And there's a successional process that does that. All right, now it's time to throw it back to you. If coral reefs continue to die off globally, how do you think that would affect specialist species such as the butterfly fish over time? Remember to explain your answer. And until next time, keep thinking.